Hello everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today I just want to talk to you about 10 essential sewing skills that beginners need to master to be successful in their sewing projects. I teach sewing in a high school, and for years now I've seen how students learn to love sewing once they master a few key skills that help reduce their frustration and increase their success rate. So if you're a beginner, I really hope that these 10 skills help set you on a path to more successful and more enjoyable sewing. So let's get into it. So the first skill that I'm going to talk about today is choosing a pattern that is right for you. So I'm going to caution you against falling in love with a very complicated pattern or something that's very fitted, and I'm going to encourage you to choose something that's at the right level of difficulty for you. You want to set yourself up for success, especially on your first few projects. And along with that, you need to make sure you're choosing the correct fabric for that pattern. So if it's something that needs to be made out of a woven fabric, you have to buy a woven fabric. If it's something that has to be made out of a knit, you have to buy a knit. I've had students say to me, oh no, I really love this fabric and it's woven, but I can still make this sweatshirt or this t-shirt out of it. And then of course they can't pull it over their head. So that's not a recipe for success. So buy the right pattern for you, buy the right fabric for that pattern. And then skill number 2 is paying attention to the layout instructions. Now the layout instructions on a pattern are not carved in stone. They really are just a guideline. They're kind of worked out on a computer as the most economical way to fit your pieces onto that fabric. But as for an average size, you definitely have some leeway. If you can fit your pieces in more compactly, that's fine. But there are a few rules you need to pay attention to. Your grain line needs to go parallel to the selvage. There are definitely some times when you can break that rule, but I wouldn't break it as a beginner, not until you know when you can break that. Maybe that's a good subject for a whole other video. But for now, while you're a beginner, just stick with that. Grain lines parallel to your selvage. Check to see which of your pieces need to go on the fold. And one thing some of my students have done, they have cut the fold. Don't cut the fold. Pieces that go onto the fold are meant to open up to be one big piece. So don't cut the fold. Skill number 3, to be able to cut accurately, you need to use lots of pins. I tell my students to pin every corner and then about every hand width in between. And that's if you're using scissors to cut. If you're using a rotary cutter to cut, which as a beginner, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe stick with the scissors. But if you do, if you're ready for a rotary cutter, then you don't necessarily have to pin. You can just use weights. So weights work well with rotary cutters. Pins work well with scissors. But in either case, you got to make sure that that pattern piece is staying stable onto the fabric and not slipping around. You just cannot cut accurately if your pattern is moving around on you. Skill number 4, as you're cutting each piece, when you come to those little notches, those little triangles, you're going to make just a small snip right in the middle of that triangle. It has to be smaller than the triangle itself. You don't want to make a big snip. If you're using a rotary cutter, don't cut your notches with the rotary cutter because it'll definitely be too big. So just with the tip of your scissors, snip all of your notches. Those notches are important bits of information when you go to sew your garment together. So don't forget to snip your notches. Now, your pieces are all cut, your notches are snipped. Skill number 5 now involves pinning your pieces together. If you're sewing a long seam, you never just start at one end and pin your way along. It's never going to work out. So instead what you do is you pin your matching points first. Pin the corners, pin any notches, and then pin in between. That'll be a much more accurate way of pinning your seam together. I like pins being perpendicular to the seam, and then that leads us to skill number 6, which is making sure your edges stay together when you're pinning. So often I see students struggling with a seam and they can't get their pieces fitting together. It's because their edges are not being brought together. And it's just not going to fit together nicely if those edges aren't together. So pin with your edges together. Make sure you are right sides together, good side of the fabric together, and edges together. Keep those edges together even around curves. That's where it can be a bit tricky if you're putting a mountain into a valley, as I say. You got to use lots of pins. Keep those edges together as you're pinning. So this is especially important around sleeves or princess seams, things like that. Always edges together. Skill number 7 is sewing at the correct seam allowance. So sort of standard or normal seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, or if your machine is on metric, 15 millimeters from the needle or the 15 line. And to be able to sew straight like that, that's where you keep your eye. You keep your eye at that guideline, the 5/8 line or the 15 line. Your eye stays there. The needle's going to go up and down whether you watch it or not. So don't let your eye be distracted by the needle. Your eye stays right at your guideline. That's how you sew straight. And even if you're coming around a curve, you bring your edge right along that guideline. That's going to give you a nice, neat seam. Skill number 8, don't forget your back tacks at the beginning and end of every seam. After you've done your back tack at the beginning, you can even hold your threads for a few stitches to just make sure that fabric doesn't get sucked down into the machine and make a big tangle underneath. Hold those threads, give it a little tug as you're starting to encourage it along at the beginning of a seam. When you get to the end, another little back tack. That's how you tie a knot on a machine. Skill number 9. Now you did all that careful pinning. Now your job is to make sure the fabric stays where you pinned it, especially if it's a seam that has ease in it or stretch in it. Let's say you're sewing the waistband of a hoodie onto the body of the garment. You've pinned it all equally around, but now you got to make sure that it stays where you pinned it. So many times I've seen students let that extra fabric travel to the next section between the next set of pins, and they end up with all the extra fullness all in one spot. That extra fullness needs to be worked into each section. Each section that you pinned has to stay where you pinned it. And then last, skill number 10, if you do make a mistake, so often mistakes are so easy to fix. Don't let yourself get frustrated and think, oh, that's fine, I don't care, no one's ever going to notice it. Most of the time, a mistake can be very easy to fix, especially if you haven't already finished your edges. Like if once you notice that mistake, just go back in and fix it. A little pucker or something that can really ruin the look of a sleeve literally takes 2 minutes to fix. It's well worth it. And then you'll be able to feel proud of the garment that you made. So those are the 10 skills that my beginning sewers really need to master. If you're more intermediate or more advanced than that, let me know if you'd like another video like this that fits your needs better. But I hope that helped a lot of you. It really is worthwhile to pursue those 10 skills. It just makes your sewing life so much more enjoyable. So congratulations on learning a beautiful skill. I'm really happy to have you on board. And until next time on Catherine Sews, you take care.